Behind the marble statues of Greek civilization, the silent tears of enslaved women echoed the injustice of their time. Slave women in ancient Greece were vulnerable to various forms of abuse, being at the mercy of their owners' whims and desires. They suffered chilling punishments by their owners, as their identities and self-respect were crushed by them. Were these punishments driven more by a desire for justice or a means of exerting power and dominance? Prepare to be transformed to a time when oppression was rampant as we reveal to you the most chilling punishments for women slaves in ancient Greece. In ancient Greek civilization, slavery was a fundamental and widespread institution. Slaves, known as doulos in Greek, were considered the property of their owners and lacked personal freedom and legal rights. The treatment of slaves varied depending on their roles and the individual owners, but generally, slaves were considered valuable commodities and were utilized for various tasks. Women slaves in ancient Greece faced specific challenges and experiences that were distinct from their male counterparts. Their roles and treatment were influenced by both their gender and their status as slaves. If you look closely, here is a famous painting, Greek Slave by Hiram Powers, portraying a Greek slave stripped and chained at a slave market. And you would be shocked to know that even Aristotle considered slavery absolutely normal, calling them katima empsukon, a piece of property that breathes. Slaves were subjected to various forms of mistreatment, including brutal torture and abuse. This treatment would be worse when the slaves were women. The owners could get women slaves through three sources. 1. They could be captured through spoils of war or raids in a neighborhood area. 2. Parents would sell their daughters as slaves as a punishment for an excessive crime like adultery or debauchery. 3. People would claim the ownership of abandoned children found on streets and ports and consider themselves their masters, having all sorts of rights over them. The life of an unfortunate slave woman began on a desolate platform in the slave market, where they stood exposed, their worth determined by the scrutinizing eyes of potential buyers. Once sold, their destiny hinged on the whims of their owners. For those who found themselves within the confines of a household, their roles and duties were dictated by the mistress, the lawful wife, or the head of the family. If their taste pleased the mistress, they were entrusted with adorning the lady of the house, styling her, and meticulously setting her hair. Success in meeting their owner's expectations might earn them rewards, but failure would mean the risk of harsh slaps or even physical abuse. If a young woman was purchased to satisfy the master's desire, her situation would take a distressing turn. The lawful wife always had an apprehension that the newcomer with beauty, efficiency, or diligence would captivate her husband's attention. Simultaneously, the senior female slaves or an elder servant dreaded being cast aside and replaced. Thus, the desires of both the mistress and a seasoned housekeeper converged, leading to a web of intrigues and manipulation aimed at undermining the new slave's position. And the slave is crushed, locked in a suffocating struggle between the mistress's desires and the servant's jealousy. The women of the household employed various strategies to eliminate their competition. Intrigues were skillfully woven, often fabricating false accusations against the slave, blaming her for misdeeds or unfortunate incidents within the household, sometimes resulting in the slave's untimely demise. Shockingly, the owner bore no responsibility for the slave's death, as they were merely seen as possessions. For even the slightest transgressions, slave women could face severe physical punishments. Whippings were a common form of retribution, leaving painful welts and scars on their bodies. Some slave women were subjected to public humiliation as a means of deterrence. They could be publicly exposed, stripped of their clothing, and paraded through streets as objects of scorn and ridicule. This dehumanizing treatment aimed to reinforce the power dynamics, reminding both slaves and free citizens of their subservient position within society. Another chilling punishment was the branding of slaves. Owners would mark their slaves with hot irons, leaving permanent scars that signified ownership and enforced their status as property. These visible marks were a constant reminder of their subjugation and prevented any hope of escaping their plight. These acts of violence served as a brutal warning to others, instilling fear and submission. The psychological torment inflicted on slave women was equally distressing. They were often isolated and deprived of social interactions, leaving them emotionally and mentally vulnerable. Women were acquired as slaves, with specific roles in mind serving distinct functions within households. Some are destined for intimate purposes, providing specialized services to their masters or lords. Among them were the palakaias or concubines. The palakai were accepted as part of Greek society, as was found in a Greek speech. We have heterai or prostitutes for pleasure, palakai for the body's daily needs, and ganaikas or wives for the bearing of legitimate children and for the guardianship of our houses. The responsibilities of the palakai were far-reaching, encompassing various tasks and duties. They were entrusted with cleaning the master's garments, tending to their bathing needs, and diligently serving at a family, gathering of and receiving the jitters. Additionally, it was expected that they would fulfill the master's desire for affection. During social gatherings, the slave was obliged to please any guests who wished for their companionship. The master possessed sole authority, and some children were subject of abandonment or even tragic fates such as drowning. Furthermore, masters would sell their palakais to guests or other individuals for specific services. Although not classified as permanent ownership, these transactions were temporary arrangements. There is a historical account documented in Plato's dialogue called the Symposium that mentions Socrates attending a gathering where a young and attractive flute slave girl was put up for auction. According to the dialogue, a wealthy individual named Alcibiades arrives at the party in a drunken state and brings with him a young flute girl who is described as beautiful. Alcibiades, who is infatuated with Socrates, intends to present a girl as a gift to him. However, before he can do so, a bidding contest arises among the guests for the flute girl's companionship. Eventually, Agathon, the host of the gathering, wins the auction and gains the company of the flute girl. Slavery extended beyond the confines of domestic settings. Slaves were also employed in brothels, either directly acquired from the slave market or sold by their masters. Sadly, these earnings were not for the slaves. All the earnings generated by their labor were handed over to the householder. Thinking of freedom was beyond question, as slaves had no rights to be free and lead their lives as normal beings. A story of a prostitute, Naira, serves the purpose of emphasizing this point. Sold into slavery as a young girl, Naira was raised in the world of prostitution, never experiencing true freedom. Nikariti, a brothel owner, recognized the potential profit in Naira. Eventually, Nikariti sold Naira to two of her lovers, Timonarides and Eucrates. Naira stayed them for a long time until they married each other and no longer required her services. They offered her freedom on the condition that she would no longer work as a prostitute in Corinth. With the help of Phrynion, Naira managed to purchase her freedom from Timonarides and Eucrates. However, her life with Phrynion was far from ideal. He treated her poorly, subjecting her to public displays of intimacy and using her as an object of indulgence at dinners and revelries. In Megara, she resorted to prostitution again, facing hardships due to ongoing war. During this time, Stephanus, who was involved with Naira and aware of her plight, offered her protection. He took Naira and her 3 children to Athens, considering her his wife and children. Despite technically being free, Naira had to live a life of servitude, serving others and being subject to their whims. Being a slave woman in ancient Greece was truly a curse, with them being merely a property that could be bought and sold and used as per their master's desires. Do you know of any ancient civilization that abhorred slavery? Leave your answers in comments.